All right, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We're really pleased to have you with us. This is the very first installation of our new webinar series, Progressive Christian Voices, Today and Tomorrow. My name is Brian Elaine. I'm the founder of Compassionate Christianity and Writing for Your Life. It's a pleasure to host all of these prominent Christian authors, and they're all people that I really like and respect a lot. So it's really going to be fun to just spend time hanging out with them. All of these authors in these first four webinars have been published by Broadleaf Books or one of the other imprints from 1517 Media, such as Fortress Press or Beaming Books. Today's webinar will be followed by three additional webinars in the series on October 6th, 11th, and 13th. And there will be also another series of webinars sometime down the road, probably in January. So in any event, joining us tonight, Khristi Adams, Guthrie, Graves-Fitzsimmons, and Kate Rademacher. Khristi Lauren Adams is a speaker, author, youth advocate, and ordained Baptist minister. She's the author of Parable of the Brown Girl, which highlights the cultural and spiritual truths that emerge from the lives of young Black girls. Parable of the Brown Girl has received awards for Best Young Adult Book from the African American Literary Awards and the New York Black Librarians Caucus. Her next book, Unbossed, How Black Girls Are Leading the Way, will be released in the spring of 2022. So we'll definitely look forward to that, Khristi. She works as a Dean of Spiritual Life and Equity at the Hill School, where she also teaches religious studies. She's the founder and director of the Becoming Conference, an annual conference and leadership cohort designed to empower, educate, and inspire girls between the ages of 13 to 18. Khristi is a graduate of Temple University and a graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary. She currently sits on the advisory board for Word Made Flesh, a nonprofit organization existing to serve among the most vulnerable of the world's poor. So Khristi, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Guthrie Graves-Fitzsimmons is on a mission to reclaim religion from political conservatives. Amen. According to Teen Vogue. A progressive Christian writer and activist for almost a decade, he has worked in faith-based public policy advocacy. He currently is a fellow in the Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative with the Center for American Progress. Guthrie is the author of Just Faith, Reclaiming Progressive Christianity from Broadleaf, and is the founder of The Resistance Prays. He's a frequent commentator on religion and politics for a variety of national news outlets. Guthrie is a graduate of Union Theological Seminary, where he was the William Sloane Coffin Scholar in Christian Social Ethics. Guthrie's been featured on several Writing for Your Life events and is a contributor to our book, How to Heal Our Divides. He lives in Louisville, Kentucky with his husband, Reverend John Russell Sanger. So welcome, Guthrie. Yay, good book cover. Kate Rademacher's latest book is Reclaiming Rest, The Promise of Sabbath, Solitude, and Stillness in a Restless World, also from Broadleaf. Kate works in international public health and is the author of Their Faces Shown and Following the Redbird. In recognition of Kate's leadership in global health, she is the inaugural cohort of Women Lift Health, sponsored by Stanford University. She's also been a featured speaker at several of our Writing for Your Life events and is a contributor to Compassionate Christianity. So Kate lives with her family in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So, Kate, thanks for joining us. So this evening, we have several topics to discuss, and but let's start with each of you maybe telling us a little bit more of your background and maybe a little bit more about your most recent book. Khristi, could you get us started?
Yeah, I forgot that my bio gave pretty much most of the background. So I don't know what else to say. Except for, I am in Pottstown, Pennsylvania at the Hill School. And I teach a class called Religion in Film and Contemporary Society and a class called Religious Radicals, which is an ode to a professor of mine who just passed away, Professor Albert Rabbitoe from Princeton University, who taught religious radicals. So that's what I do as far as my day job is concerned. And just been writing and didn't really stumble into it. It's just something that sort of eventually sort of evolved for me. I didn't set out to be an author or anything like that. And people ask me that quite often, like, when did you know? And I'm like, I'm not really sure I had a road to Damascus moment when it came to writing. It just happened, you know.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Parable of the Brown Brook, because that was such an important book.
Parable came about actually when I was in the car, just driving home. I had done some counseling and was doing some one-on-one counseling at a counseling, it's called the Christian Wellness Center, Counseling Center in New Jersey. I was living there at the time. And I just would have these profound, intimate moments of one-on-one counseling, pastoral counseling with these young Black girls. And I remember being in the car thinking to myself on the way home, I feel so full when I leave these sessions, just as much as I feel like they are coming to me. I feel like I'm getting so much from them. And I felt fuller than I felt leaving church on a Sunday morning. I remember thinking that specifically, wow, I want for other people to experience this fullness of this wisdom that I'm getting from these girls. And I promised myself if I ever had the opportunity, a platform to center their voices, then I would. And so Parable sort of came to me that way, not in that moment. It's probably maybe like a year after that. But yeah, that was a promise that I made to myself. The Parable, the stories are sort of written anonymously. And the new book that I've written, Unbossed, are actual girls that are in leadership now. The only problem, and I was telling my editor this earlier today, is that when you write about actual girls, they change so much in 2 years. I was just looking at one who's like, her hair, when I interviewed her and we have her picture in the book and it's like out to here. She's, adolescent girl. She just shaved it all off. So she doesn't even look like that anymore. So I'm like, they grow, they evolve, So the leadership of the girls that I'm writing about now, these are girls that are actually leading organizations or movements and things like that. But in Parable, they were anonymous stories. So the girls' identities were kept secret.
Good. Well, we'll talk about future work more in a few minutes. Guthrie, welcome. And, tell us a little bit what happens in policy work, government policy work. That's kind of opaque to me.
Thanks so much, Brian. And it is a complicated world of navigating the public policy world. And I work at a secular think tank, the Center for American Progress, but I'm on a small team that deals with religion and gets to work with faith leaders, which I really love because faith leaders, are the prophets in our society that are proclaiming a better world and casting that vision of how we ought to live, that, we should live in a world at peace, a world where everybody has their needs met, where no child goes hungry, where there's no violence in our communities. And so I get to work with that kind of vision. And then my colleagues, somewhat get to work out the details of all of the policy proposals. But it's a dream job getting to work with faith leaders. And I grew up as the son of two labor union organizers and was always involved in progressive politics and saw my parents work, with worker dignity and worker rights. It's just the kind of other side of the coin from what I'd been learning in church about what Jesus taught. And then I kind of grew up and realized the religious right existed. And that was really struggled with that and saw how much of our politics revolves around the religious right. And that disconnect made me want to get involved in this faith and public policy work. And so it's a kind of simple story for me. And I've been able to do this work for about a decade now. And then the writing I came to kind of after working in the field for a while and just wanting to see how the media could be used to really uplift the work that was going on, that there is so activism going on in faith-based communities, but it doesn't get a lot of attention. And so I see it as my mission to uplift all of the work that's going on all around the country and all around the world, really. I'm really interested in progressive faith movements in other countries as well. And to do that in large platforms and make sure that the narrative of Christianity and religion is told better in this country. And so I was working on one article and it just kept getting longer and longer and longer. I was like, no one's going to publish this unless it's a book. And that was a really daunting thought. But then it came several years later, it came out. And so Just Faith,
Awesome.
Reclaiming Progressive Christianity was just me writing and writing and writing. And I wrote it as a love letter to progressive Christians, that every city I've been to across this country has a community of Christ followers doing the work of love and justice and creating a better world. Now, it may not be a mega church amusement park kind of thing, but there is a committed group of people doing this work of love and justice. Like when I was growing up and my parents were involved with the minimum wage campaign, it was like the Black church in Houston where I grew up was the heart of that campaign, was the heart of the organizing infrastructure where I grew up. And so I just kept adding examples of all the different progressive advocacy that was rooted in the church, and it became a book. And so I'm just continuing every way I know how to uplift the existence of progressive people of faith and progressive Christians, progressive Baptists. Now that I'm a Baptist, all different kind of levels of different communities I'm a part of. And thanks for having me on, Brian. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
I mean, Guthrie, you and I share that mission, right? Because progressive Christianity is so fragmented, and so much of it's not heard, and we are both working to try to help solve that, which I think is a really important thing to do. So thank you very much. Kate, welcome, Kate. One of the things I have to do is give Kate a shout out for thinking of this whole idea to do this webinar series in the first place and convincing me to do it. So Kate, thank you very much for helping this to be a reality.
Well, thank you, Brian. You're the best because you're always up for a new thing. You're just so entrepreneurial and creative and welcome any ideas. And I think Carl McCullum and I approached you, right? And so thank you. I mean, you're just amazing how you make things happen and bring people together. So thank you so much.
Well, that's my job. But anyway, so you have a different day job. So why don't you tell us about, your bivocational world?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. So yeah, as Brian knows, I identify as being bivocational. So I have a busy day job at International Public Health. I manage a portfolio of activities focused on expanding access to contraception in low-income countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And so, I have a master's in public health from UNC in Chapel Hill. And so I was living my life, and then things changed. Guthrie, you said your story is simple. My story is not so simple. I was very unexpectedly found myself on a conversion journey in my early 30s, and was baptized in my early 30s, and was confirmed in the Episcopal Church by Bishop Curry, actually, who was in the North Carolina diocese at the time. So I was very surprised by that. I'm married to a very devout Buddhist and remain sort of surprised that Jesus called me to him. But I'm such a joyful convert. I was raised by a social justice activist mom, but not as a Christian. And my mom says she's always okay with me being my foil. My mom's been a social justice activist and warrior for 50 years, but she has a lot of squeamishness, I think it's fair to say, around Christianity, and I really kind of internalized those messages. So for me, Guthrie, your book, I stayed up last night reading it till midnight. I'm like your constituent. I feel like my work in expanding access to contraception is deeply informed by my faith. I feel like is part of my vocation. But I haven't talked about that in the public square. And so I am just really sort of coming to that and being more vocal about my faith. And part of that is writing. Again, not only did I get surprised by being called to the Christian faith, I was really surprised that I just felt this restless urge to start writing about it. My first memoir was published a couple of years ago about my quirky conversion journey, and then Reclaiming Rest was published. I had another memoir, and then Reclaiming Rest came out this summer. So, and I think it's really, it's about Sabbath keeping, but it's really, for me, I talk about Sabbath as kind of an ongoing vehicle of my conversion, because growing up, being raised by a social justice activist and sort of growing up in a very, very progressive community, I think there's this temptation to sort of feel like we have to save the world ourselves. And one of the kind of most challenging things for me theologically is to really, and that I keep getting challenged each week by the Sabbath, is the idea that I am not God and I'm not going to save the world by myself, and that part of that I'm called to work and I'm also called to rest. And I think I talk to a lot of people who are deeply committed to justice who are exhausted and burned out. The World Health Organization classified burnout as an occupational phenomenon for the first time 2 years ago. So I think so many of us are struggling with fatigue and exhaustion. And so I think as we talk about what it means to be a progressive Christian, and I think we also need to be talking about rest as part of that. And Bishop Curry does such a beautiful job too about talking about rest as part of the way of love. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I like literally spent the weekend reading both Khristi and Guthrie's books. So I mostly have like a ton of questions for them. So I'm just delighted to be part of this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. And so let's move on to that next, because, you know, you all are really smart people. So I'm very interested to know what you're paying attention to. What are you reading that is influencing you, particularly from, you know, a progressive Christian social justice standpoint? So Khristi, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm actually rereading the autobiography of Malcolm X. I spent all summer I usually just do one book in the summer. I'm not one of those people that's going to be reading like a bunch of books, you know, all at once. I'm like, okay, I'm going to focus in on this one. Part of it is because I was teaching it as well in one of my classes, but it's timeless. I have like 3 behind me right now. You know, it's just, it's not a Christian book, of course, but it's definitely it's a narrative, a spiritual conversion narrative, definitely timeless piece, the things that X says, and also difficult things, you know, it's very critical, and justifiably so, but just how the context and how someone grows up shapes them so much, and even religiously, and just how he evolved even toward the end of his life. So I'm rereading that. It's also for me, particularly in a space like I'm in now, I'm at a boarding school and it's a predominantly white institution. Malcolm X can be a difficult read. And so it's important for me to interpret it, not water it down, but also interpret it as a historical text, but also a deeply spiritual one. I didn't mention this earlier. I grew up in the Black church. That's just sort of like, there were no evangelicals as far as I was concerned growing up. I was just so shielded by my experience. And my pastor at the time, he was very, very heavily involved in the community. He was worked for Rainbow Push Coalition under Jesse Jackson. He was Secretary of State for New Jersey. Buster Stories, I think, Brian, you probably know who you have a familiarity. But so I was like, I grew up in that. And so even rereading pieces like Malcolm X, I mean, that's just sort of, it was sort of required reading for us, you know, in our community, you know, growing up. It wasn't, oh, he's Christian or he's not, you know, no, it was he's, you know, a Black man that's been shaped by society, by the unfortunate injustices in society, but also by, you know, just by his context, by his upbringing, and also religiously and sort of what that means. So that's where I am right now. It's not a progressive Christian book, but, you know, that's just sort of truthfully where I'm. So I'm doing a lot of underlining because there's a lot of stuff that is said that is so relevant to where we're at today.
Well, I can totally believe that. And I do the same thing when I read. I have a red, you know, pen that I underline half the book. But it's important for me to learn anyway. So thank you. Guthrie, how about you? What have you been reading lately?
Well, I do the opposite. I don't annotate anything in my books, but then I spend 30 minutes looking for that quote. I wish I could remember. So I should annotate. I ran a show and tell for the books that are some of my favorites right now. A More Perfect Union, which is also out from Broadleaf Books by Adam Russell Taylor, the new president of Sojourners, a great book. And I love knowing what authors are doing, not, you know, when they're not writing, because, you know, a lot of people can have opinions, but it's like, how are you living your life? And I've actually worked with Adam my entire career in different capacities and know that he's out there. He's talking about what it means to, you know, create the beloved community today, which is a great book. Another one, How to Have an Enemy, this is a wonderful book. Really reshaped my thinking about loving your enemies. So often that is used to mollify people and tell people not to, engage in social justice activism or to be quiet and to not raise, not be critical. And Jesus is called to love your enemies. Melissa is a Mennonite pastor, and it's all about how you can love your enemy while also confronting them and holding them accountable. It's just a wonderful book. And then the last one by Vanessa Cook is Spiritual Socialists. And I think sometimes the discussion of this is a great history book about like far left kind of economic socialism and, informed by people of different faiths. And that really, for me, grounded, even I sometimes find myself being like, progressive Christian means like people who maybe vote Democratic or moderates. And no, there is like a far hard left socialist, like, capitalism has completely failed, and that's rooted in their faith. And so I always need reminders, even myself, that there are Christians across the political, economic, social spectrum in so many different places that are approaching it from their faith. And Vanessa's book was great, talking about spiritual socialism and, all the, Bernie Sanders, who's Jewish, obviously, went and he spoke to Christian audiences all the time about how his kind of democratic socialism. There's a great article in Sojourners, too, about AOC's biblical values, about how the democratic socialism is rooted for her and so many other people in their faith. So those are some of the books I'm currently reading. I like to have a lot of books I'm kind of reading slowly.
Very cool. I often do that too. So what can you say? Kate, how about you?
Yeah, Guthrie, I'm glad to hear, and Brian, because I'm like you, I have like a bazillion books. My family just can't believe it. Like I have so many books everywhere that I'm like in and out of. And Khristi, I don't know what's like better, but like the like focus, I think both have benefits. So I feel like I'm like teacher's pet but I really am. I really did spend the weekend reading Khristi's book and Guthrie's book. And so I'm just going to give them both a shout out. I serve on the board of an organization called National Crittenton. And so Khristi's book really just sung to me in that space. And that organization works with girls and gender expansive youth who are impacted by violence and chronic poverty and trauma. And so Khristi, what I just really appreciate about your book so much, and I'm only a couple chapters in, is just really like that you're attending to the spiritual lives of Black and brown girls. And I just really, I think a lot of the work that's been done with ACEs, et cetera, we're thinking a lot about trauma and emotional wellness, but I think really just bringing sort of the spiritual perspective of what these girls are going through is just so important and powerful. I'm grateful for that. And like I said, I feel like Guthrie was just, your book is sort of really serves to me as a call to action, because what I'm really taking from it is, again, that there's this silent majority of progressive Christians, and the data that you show about that actually progressive Christians vastly outnumber conservative Christians is such an eye-opener. I just called my mom this afternoon. I was like, guess what? She's like, no. So it is very validating, as you say in your book. And I think we need to do people like me who, again, as I said at the beginning, are deeply, deeply informed on a daily basis by my faith, and stay very silent about that in the public domain. And again, I've done that for various, very specific reasons. I work in birth control, and who is the face of opposition to birth control in our country? So it's not just my colleagues, but it's also my donors. So again, I think I need to be part of that solution of challenging the voice and also reclaiming the history. And I think that that's really, that's something I wrote about in my book. I was really affected by, when I was researching and writing my book, the book, A Stone of Hope, Prophetic Religion and the Death of Jim Crow by David Chappelle out of UNC. And he really writes about how we get it wrong, like the credit we give to the civil rights movement, really belongs not to the sort of secular Northern liberals, but rather to the like the prophetic work of Black Christian activists in the South. And so that really deeply that book really changed my own understanding of history. And Guthrie, you really go into that in a lot of detail in your book, which really just, I think we have to reclaim the history of progressive faith in this country throughout the 20th century and into this century. So anyway, again, I'm not just saying it, y'all's books are really hitting the spot. So thank you both very much.
Kate, could you repeat the one you just recommended?
Yeah, it's kind of an academic book. It's A Stone of Hope, Prophetic Religion and the Death of Jim Crow by David Chappelle. I can put it in the chat. He's an academic historian and actually identifies as an atheist, but he really says, anyway, it's very interesting just that we get the narrative about the civil rights movement wrong. And again, Guthrie, you can say more about this, but I think you really amplify that point in your book as well.
Good. Well, I've got two that I wanted to mention. One of them was called Reparations, a Christian Call for Repentance and Repair. I won't say that I'm terribly well read on reparations, but I just love this book. I just thought it was just very compelling and insightful. So that's one that I've been really excited about. And then I think in terms of impact, Brian Mclaren's book, Faith After Doubt, describes 4 different stages a lot of folks go through in terms of their faith journey over the years. And I think it's a very useful book, particularly for people who maybe started off, in an evangelical or fundamentalist kind of environment. But having said that, I think it's really helpful for lots of people. So in any event, so we have a person who's raised their hand. Henry Leese, would you like to ask a question? You can unmute if you'd like to. Okay, we will come back to Henry. Okay, so let's move on a little bit. We've gone through a lot the last few years on multiple dimensions, whether it's COVID or politics or religious divides, all kinds of serious issues, racial divides probably being the biggest, I think. But I'd like to hear from each of you what you think are the most pressing issues that, we as progressive Christians should figure out how to deal with. Khristi, again, why don't you go first?
Sorry. I was thinking about this when you sent it earlier, and I was like, wow, I can list all the isms, right? Of course, I can definitely start with racism and homophobia, et cetera. And I'm sure we will talk about those. I spoke at chapel here a week ago, and I talked about just kindness, empathy, just some of the basic. And I'm like, we're not as a community going to be able to tackle some of these deeply rooted social issues, wounds, et cetera, if we don't just have like basic kindness down, right? Like just basic love your neighbor. I mean, I see that a lot on Twitter, and I feel like it's, love is sort of overused, but even deeper than that is just we are, I don't want to say a sociopathic society, but I just really feel like we are like a breeding ground of lack of empathy, particularly in the last 5 years. And we're passing that on to sort of younger generations. I wouldn't say that that's a social issue, but I'd say that it is a pressing issue. We're definitely in this sort of latter days generation, quote unquote, of this love of many will grow cold. And I never saw that as being like the mission of the church. I never saw that as being missional, that statement. But now in the last, last year or so, I'm like, wow, that's missional. That's not just, oh, the love of many is going to grow cold and that's it. It's not a statement. It's a mission, right? And sort of it's like, okay, now how do we address this? A problem statement and needing to come up with solutions and addressing it. One of the things that I try to do, and not to sort of bring back everything in the book, but, like when I think about parable, if there have been any positive reception or whatever it might be to the book is people sort of like noticing the approach to these young girls as my teachers. I think maybe once upon a time, the evangelical church, they probably still are, very like missions. Let's go take pictures with Black babies and, go across the ocean or whatever it is that we're doing. I feel like they were on to something, but just the selfishness and pride masked that and got in the way. We really are supposed to be immersing ourselves, I think, among the least of these, right? Or among the underserved or the marginalized or whatever, immersing ourselves, not so that we can be sort of like the colonizing helpers, but immersing ourselves so that we can learn, right? Like so that we can be transformed. Blessed are the poor. And so, really when it comes to the young people that I work with, whether it's teaching or the girls with becoming or whatever, it is your spiritual transformation will take place. Your understanding of empathy, et cetera, you getting closer to God will take place when you get allowed this demographic or this group or this experience to be your teacher. But it has to be so opposite, so uncomfortable, so, like I said, immersive. I'm speaking broadly because I know my panelists will speak very like directly and specifically, right? But, I truly believe that. And so it sort of goes into something else about, how will we go about in doing that? Us sort of identifying not just, oh, I'm going to go to the Boys and Girls Club or, oh, I'm just going to go downtown to such and such and, feed the poor people. The mentality completely has to shift, right? To like I keep saying, they are my teacher. Like to becoming uncomfortable, to, not just rolling your sleeves up and serving, but quite literally like the vulnerability and the humility of you becoming less than, right? Because the poor will always be with us. These communities will sort of always be with us. Well, why? And I think part of that is because that's the only way we're going to transform. That's why Jesus, I think, said, oh, you get the rich man, give all your money to the poor, give everything away to the rich man. He's like, oh, I can't do that. He's like, that's the only way you're going to be transformed. That's the only way you're going to be saved. And I think that's the only way we're going to understand empathy. I think once that door opens, I think once we as a community begin to do that, if we do, then we can tackle some of these other isms. We can tackle some of these other issues. Actually, I don't think it would be that much of an issue. You know what I mean? Like, I think it would be like a domino effect, but we just, we were doing LGBTQ week here for our school and courageous conversations around. And there was a speaker that we had today, and she was saying she identifies as, she says, oh, they, them, or you can call me she, her. He was explaining to the students, and we overheard there were some students that made some comments, right, about it. And I'm thinking, wow, just last week I was talking about, I know for the most part, she was widely, sort of praised and, celebrated at the end of the talk. But, there's always like two, but I kept thinking, you didn't get past A last week. There's no way, you know what I mean? Like, there's no way I can sit and have, and I say no way, but a conversation with you. I'm not going to list out the issues to you or why it's important for you to not and understand all of that, when being a decent human being is square one, and we haven't even mastered that, being a decent, kind, empathetic human being. So I really, truly believe that that's where we start, and then it emerges from there.
Sorry. Yeah, empathy is pretty important, pretty fundamental, isn't it? Guthrie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, when I was thinking about this question, I thought about I teach Bible study every Sunday at Highland Baptist Church here in Louisville, Kentucky. And during the pandemic, we were, meeting over Zoom and everything. And I was like, this is the perfect opportunity to study the book of Revelation, verse by verse, something I had not gotten around to yet in life. And yet, I was sort of familiar with the empire critical reading of Revelation. But I don't know, sitting with this book week after week during the pandemic really drove home the meaning of writing in this kind of dramatic, apocalyptic fashion that unveils, going back to the meaning of apocalypse in the Greek, unveils so much about what's going on, the status of our society, about who is first and who should be last, about the way we should order our society is wrong, and that it is wrong not just in a kind of secular sense, but wrong on a deeply divine level. And I think I'm also a kind of eternal optimist. That's being raised by union organizers who, on the picket line and everything, and just face terrible odds to organize right now, given all the destruction of collective bargaining rights in this country, especially in the South, where I grew up and still live. I'm an optimist. And so my hope is that this pandemic and this moment we're in really does unveil a lot about how wrong how wrong we allow our society to be. The idea that healthcare is a choice, that we allow people to be denied healthcare, housing, food, basic rights, basic standard of living. We choose as a country to allow people to die, to allow people to just have an economy that fails so many. And that is, I think, been unveiled to a lot of people during the pandemic. The work of Black Lives Matter activists have unveiled the deep systemic racism in our country, and there are deep ways to address that, like reparations, like Congresswoman Barbara Lee's Truth and Reconciliation bill, which I think is really necessary to get at the deep lies we've told about race in this country. There's been a unveiling of just how much overt white Christian nationalism, all the people at the insurrection, as awful as that was, those people, the insurrectionists, have always been here throughout American history. And so a lot is being unveiled right now that we have to address. And it's all interconnected, and it's all, that's why it's hard to list specific issues, because so many things are connected. The border situation, so many different things we're seeing now. And my hope is that we're in a period where the seeing will lead to collective action.
I hope so too. I was thinking, the same thing, Guthrie, that hopefully this will be a positive attribute of the terrible things we've had to go through for the pandemic, but remains to be seen. Kate, how about you?
Yeah, so Brian, just to circle back to your question about sort of priorities or pressing priorities, so many people that I talk to are really deeply, deeply exhausted. And, building on sort of what I talk about in Reclaiming Rest, I think we really need to recognize the role of rest in our spiritual lives, and not just as a self-care strategy, but truly as not just as a hack, but truly as we discern what our vocational calling is to work, really honoring also the role of holy rest. And I think just so many people I know who are doing amazing work are just at the end of their ropes. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has really revealed, especially for working parents, is that our society is not working for working parents, and that we need to build back better. And part of that, I think, we need to the other thing I just want to really emphasize is that rest is not just a personal issue. It's something, Sabbath is something we do in community. And I think as we evaluate how we can build back better, we need to be thinking about rest as a justice issue. And Guthrie, I didn't see this in your book, Guthrie. Maybe this is something you can in your next book. But really, a Sabbath ethic has informed our labor laws for decades, and we have a history of having a public policy that is informed by a Sabbath ethic and a Sabbath theology. So I think as we ask ourselves, who has the right to rest and who can afford to rest? And those are, of course, two questions. And I think as progressive Christians, we often focus on who can afford to rest. And I think the minimum wage discussion that's going on right now is a perfect example of that. We also have to ask ourselves who has the right to rest. I mean, Breonna Taylor was literally murdered while she was sleeping. So I think, there's just been some compelling writing about who has the right to rest in our society. So, and it's interesting. One of the greatest pushbacks I get from Christians about the Sabbath is about equity. And I think it's this question of like, well, is Sabbath really like, for the privileged elite that only who can afford to take a Sabbath? And I think that we really need to turn that question upside down. And if we have a society where, the Sabbath was intended to be a great equalizer, right? Like everyone was supposed to have the right to rest. So if not everyone in our society has the right to rest and can afford to rest, we know something is wrong. And so that's, I think, has to be part of this discussion as we talk about sort of the way forward is how do we, again, have that, we focus so much on the work we need to do to be better, but also, again, just on a personal level, I don't know about you all, but I just need to stay grounded in my own, prayer practice and spiritual disciplines of stillness so that I can stay close to God as I'm discerning where I am being called to serve in the world and to lead in the world. And so I think that that's something that hopefully we can also be supporting one another to do as progressive Christians, is to stay really grounded in those practices of stillness and prayer, solitude, rest, holy rest, so that we can, be really enlivened and lifted through the Holy Spirit as we carry our work forward.
Thank you, Kate. Khristi, there's a question for you that came in through Q&A from Ron. He asked, how did you write for such a diverse audience? How do you communicate core values and issues without switching for different audiences?
Well, I talk about code switching in the book, right? Which is like a thing, particularly for us as for Black women, right? And predominantly or majority white spaces, we have to sort of like know how to talk the talk, and we feel this pressure to turn on and turn off. Well, when I'm talking or mentoring my girls that I work with, I'm always like, after a while you evolve sort of out of that, right? Where you're able to just be your authentic self, still be professional, know your context, but you approach everything as your authentic self. So whether I'm in a staff meeting, board meeting, or speaking on stage or with my homies, like, there's certain things that I do. I know the context, but I sort of try to stay true. It's a spiritual discipline. It's definitely like a personal thing. So when I was writing, or even when I continue to write, I have to be very intentional about not writing, like thinking too much about, I got to make sure I'm writing for everybody, right? Because when I do that, it definitely reflects and it comes off inauthentic in my writing. One of the things, Parable was under Fortress Press before it moved into Broadleaf, and Emily Brower at the time was my editor. And Emily would, I would be thinking about all the different audiences. I want to make sure this speaks to everybody. And she would comment back on the side, you guys know how it is, like on the side, all the little comments or whatever. And she's like, there's not enough about Black girls in this chapter. Actually, you don't even say the phrase Black girls enough in this chapter. Sort of like go back to the drawing board. And I was like, I thought I was, but I was trying to make sure that everybody understood that, like, it's just like, no, you're talking about Black girls. That's who your demographic is. That's who you're talking about. And everyone will fall in line and everyone will adjust. And ever since then, I've really sort of kept that mentality. that, Jesus understood his, who his audience was. How are the Gospels still speaking to us today? And contextually, right, in a completely different society and a context. So I try to keep that in mind as much as possible. I think I read here something about, you said Buster did this as well. Yeah, well, also I'm a product of Buster stories too, right? Obviously, I've been under him since I was 8 years old. So yeah, he was like very much a genius. He still is at knowing his context, but also sort of remaining true to who you are. So I felt like writing the girl's story should be able to speak for themselves, and whoever's life was ministered to or spoken to as a result, it's like, just because they're Black girls doesn't mean they're young, doesn't mean that we all can't learn something from them, no matter where you're from, right? Like that we all can't see Jesus or the divine reflected in these girls and their stories alone by itself without me having to embellish it or change it up or to make it shift, so that for the particular audience that I'm wanting to sell the book to. So that, again, I'm saying that out loud, but that's something that was like a constant in my head and in my practice from the beginning to the end of the book, and the same thing with Unbossed.
Very cool. So here's a question from Sarah to anyone who would like to take it. Do you think the Latino Catholicism has a place in progressive Christianity?
Yes, I can jump in there. I think I'm not sure what's behind that question, but I think Latino Catholics, Latino evangelicals, definitely mainline Protestants, across the different breakdowns of Christianity, have a very active place in the movement. And I think we get into trouble when people try to define what progressive is, because I've never met anyone I agree with all the time. On any, I don't agree. I disagree with my husband every day, about something. And so, I think there are people who consider themselves progressive and are active in social justice on a number of issues who I maybe disagree with. In my book, Just Faith, I write about, there's disagreement among people thinking about war, like among strict pacifists versus people who think maybe there's a genocide about to happen in another country. We should intervene to prevent the genocide. And both those people, I'm not going to say, we have to divide up groups and like have a litmus test of everyone that is progressive. So yes, there are a lot of Latino progressive Christians, Catholics, especially, in the pews. Too often we get concerned with what leaders are doing and especially I write a lot about Catholics in the book and spend a lot of my time dealing with Catholics. The bishops are one category, right? And it's a very hierarchical system, but the bishops are still one category. And there are so many people in the pews that have a diversity of beliefs. So go and, look at statistics from Pew Research Center from, the majority of Latino Catholics don't want to overturn Roe v. Wade, for instance. If you actually look at statistics, the picture of Latino Catholicism in the country will change versus what the bishops are saying. And it's very diverse, including many progressives.
I'm going to jump on that just in a very basic. The most Catholic movie that Pixar ever made was Coco, right? I'm saying this because, again, I'm teaching religion and film right now, and Coco is our film for next week. And the Day of the Dead is inherently spiritual and Catholic. It's a part of more of the Mexican Catholicism, but I always say sort of at the end of that week with my students is sort of like, what is Coco speaking to us? What's the essential question here, or the statement that is the film is trying to make through this? And we see that through the lens of the Day of the Dead, this idea of remembrance, right? Well, we all know remembrance is very much an essential part of our Christian faith, right? And, do this in remembrance of me, but this idea of keeping alive those that came before us. The reason why I'm saying this is because there are doors that are open even through that, that speak to our mission as progressive Christians or as Body of Christ or whatever that wherever you might land on that spectrum. But the common ground we find here, right, through just even that film and through that film's lens of sort of like highlighting, again, an inherently Catholic part of Mexican tradition. We watch that and cry our tears, and we call our loved ones, and all of that. But one thing we don't say is, oh man, that was Mexican Catholicism. No, we've found a way to find common ground even in a film like that, that even speaks to our mission when it comes to I guess, progressive Christianity.
Well, personally, I would have a hard time drawing really strict lines between any us and them categorization, right? And I'm guilty of using the word progressive around this seminar series, right? Because I felt like, well, I've got to somehow describe what it is, who, I think we're going to be talking about. But for me to say, oh, well, these people are progressive, these people are not. I mean, that's not for me to do as far as I'm concerned. I mean, to me, that's up to them, up to the individuals to decide, whether they're a progressive Christian or not.
Yes, I did.
And, it's like, on the Compassionate Christianity website, I say to folks, it's up to you to decide whether you're Christian or not. I mean, it's not for me to decide that, right? So anyway, back to the question about progressive Latinos or Latino Catholics as progressive. I mean, I think that's up to them. In any event, question from Eileen. I'm a progressive Baptist pastor in North Carolina. One of my deep concerns is for the undocumented parents in our community. Can you speak to effective ways to advocate for this group? Anyone want to take that?
You cut out at the end, Brian. Can you say to advocate for the group? Was that what?
I'm sorry. It says, one of my deep concerns is for the undocumented parents in our community. Can you speak to effective ways to advocate for that group?
I can share one piece of advice, which is to call your member of Congress and let them know what, the action you want to see done. But now that might be what any activist will tell you to do, right? Call the people responsible for the policy and ask them to change it to one that is more life-giving. But I want to ask you to do it as a pastor. Now, everyone on this call might not be a pastor. Some of us, may just be people of faith in the pews, grassroots Christians. And I think the key and what really changes things in Washington is when people start advocating as Christians and making that explicit, because I can tell you from my experience in a lot of meetings on Capitol Hill, they are hearing from Christians who are opposed to immigration, who want to deport all undocumented immigrants. Those Christians are very loud. And, Trump was very loud about his Christian faith, right? He held up the Bible when he cleared the protesters out, the Black Lives Matter protesters with tear gas. They're very loud, and they say as Christians, Romans 13, kick all immigrants out. They didn't come the right way. That thin veil of Bible they place over their racism. So what I am asking people to do, and I think it's very effective, not in an exclusive way, I tell this to rabbis and imams and people of all different faiths, is to do it out of your faith and make that explicit in your advocacy. And one group I work with that I'll recommend is called Faithful America, faithfulamerica.org, which is an online community where you sign petitions to Congress and other people that have the power to change policy. And you do it as a Christian, which I think is just really changes the entire dynamics of our politics in Washington if we all do that.
Excellent advice. Excellent advice. Thank you. Well, I would like to leave a little bit of time for each of our panelists to talk a little bit about what projects they're working on next. Obviously without, revealing anything that you can't reveal, but I'd love for you to think, to share with folks kind of where you're headed. What are you focusing on going forward? So Khristi, again, do you want to start off with that?
Yeah, thank you for that too, by the way, just an opportunity to share. I'd already mentioned the follow-up to Parable, The Brown Girl, is called Unbossed, which is actually taken from Shirley Chisholm's presidential campaign, the first Black woman to run for president, actually 50 years ago in January. It will be 50 years ago this upcoming January. So the phrase unbossed was inspired by her campaign slogan, unbought and unbossed. But this is called Unbossed, How Black Girls Are Leading the Way. And that's the adult version. There's a middle grade version with Beaming Books called Black Girls Unbossed, Young World Changers Leading the Way, pretty much the same thing. It's about 8 young women from the ages of 15. I interviewed some of them too, like a year ago or so. So they were a little bit younger, but 15 to about 22. Who are all just making significant change in their community in the respective areas. And just examples of girls, I've got Tia Moy Roberts, who was one of the young Black activists that came out of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in the wake of the Parkland shooting. There were a young group of Black students there that said, hey, we're being overlooked. We were a part of this too. We were victims of this too, particularly when all the spotlight was being put on the young students that came out of that back in like 2018, I think it was. And then she went on to be a speaker and a board member for March for Our Lives. And is, but the point of the book is sort of to highlight the girls, their narratives, their leadership, but also like particular leadership style that they have. So, transformational leaders, what I would call Tia Moy, and I go just into detail, sort of like the academics of transformational leadership, but also Black women that came before her and all of us that were transformational leaders like Fannie Lou Townsend Hamer, for example. And then just sort of the chapters end with sort of giving sort of leadership wisdom that I learned from each of the girls. So you have activists like Tia Moy, but then you also have environmental ethicists, activists. We've got, sort of a Black Lives Matter activist, but they all just come from different spectrums, mental health advocacy. One girl was diagnosed with stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma when she was just 7 years old. And then when, just another year or two later, her and her mother started an organization called the We Can Serve Foundation, just serving young kids that are sick and in foster care. And she wound up being a CNN Young Wonder. They think they call them Young Wonders and not heroes. So I just have very much enjoyed writing about them, and I can't wait to share their stories. They are all different now. It's fun to see how much they've evolved, but we'll see their pictures in the books and their actual stories, their actual organizations, and in the middle grade, their illustrations of the girls. So that warms my heart very differently than Parable, because again, those were anonymous and I couldn't really share who those girls were, but to put these girls out front and center has been a joy. So that comes out International Women's Day, 2022. So March 8th, 2022, both of the books come out.
So we'll definitely do a book launch interview, Khristi, when Matt was ready, because I know a lot of people want to hear more about that. So thank you. Guthrie, how about you? What kinds of innovative new things have you got cooking?
I want to write about international Christian progressive solidarity.
Wow.
One of the most interesting moments of my time in seminary, I was at Union Theological Seminary in New York, I was sitting in systematic theology with the late Reverend Dr. James Cone, and he casually mentioned in the middle of a lecture, oh yeah, I was co-teaching a course with Gustavo Gutierrez. And I was like, wait, what? You'd co-taught in like early 1970s. He was like, oh, I co-taught this course. I was writing about Black liberation theology. Gutierrez was writing about, speaking of Latino Catholics, progressive Latino Catholics, Gutierrez, he was writing about liberation theology in a Latin American context. And so we decided to co-teach a course. And so after class, I go, Dr. Cone, do you still have the syllabus? And we go up to his office and he found it.
Wow.
It was just so much fun. And those connections across so many different cultures inspired by Jesus's revolutionary social justice ethos, that people are living it out in very different places. It's really inspiring to me. That a lot of Christians in New Zealand, for instance, have been active in really kind of addressing the harms they did as colonizers, and kind of coming to terms with that through history and reparations and changes to policy today with Indigenous people of New Zealand. And so I'm very interested in looking all over the world at cases of Jesus followers who saw what's going on in their own society and took action. And so that's the idea for the next book, is to expand. And I hate how so many U.S. Christians are so focused, progressive and conservative across the spectrum. People are only focused about our country. So I hope to do that kind of international look.
Oh, that's going to be very cool. Been very, I think, a great learning experience for all of us. So thank you for undertaking such a thing. Kate, what about you? What's up next?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna practice being more brave and more bold. I'm gonna, as Brian knows, something that, again, this conversation is extremely timely for me and very encouraging. And I think that's something that I hope to do with my writing, is encourage others. And I think this conversation has been really encouraging for me. I have maintained, I talk about being bivocational at the front. As I've become a Christian writer, I've really kept my lives separated. I've had two platforms, essentially, one about my public health work and one about my faith-based writing. And I was advised, actually, to keep those separate. And so I feel like I'm at a place where I want to break down some of those barriers in my own self. And I think that really is timely for this conversation, because, I'm out there doing evidence-based public health work. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. There's a raging, debate about vaccine efficacy. It's like we need evidence-based public, people who are also deeply, deeply comfortable being open about how their faith informs their work and galvanizes their work. And, that's, again, I'm sort of the constituent that I think we're talking about. So I'm really going to take, my call to action is for myself to really, again, be more bold about being my full self. And that doesn't mean that I have to beat, I think, my faith-based perspective, beat that drum all the time. But I think what it means for me is showing up more fully and more honestly about, again, what motivates me, which in my work and life is my faith. So I'm excited for that, and you all can help me hopefully in that journey. And I'll also say, Guthrie, the international perspective really resonates with me deeply. I have a couple of really dear colleagues in Nigeria, and I just talked to them who supported me in my book launch and in my bivocational life. And I talked to them about this tension in the United States, where it's like this incredible sort of almost anxiety, incredible anxiety about progressive faith people. And they're just like, they're like, wow, there isn't that divide for them. It's like their work and their faith is commingled. You start meetings with prayer, and then you dive into the science, and it's all just there, and it's all one. So I think, Guthrie, as you think about international work, I think it's just, it's just like there's so much, I think, just day-to-day living where faith and life are just so intermingled. And I think we need to get back to that in the United States. So just a couple thoughts for me. But again, Brian, I also just want to thank you for your leadership. And I think, you were just doing so much to amplify the voice of progressive Christian writers. And so I just want to also thank you and really do whatever I can to help you in your work, and including to say that Healing Our Divides is an incredible book, and just really, again, appreciate all the ways you're bringing people together. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. So we've got, unfortunately, a long runway, a lot of opportunities. So the next two things up for me, short term, October 18th, we start a Christian children's book online conference as part of Writing for Your Life. And then in November, I think it's November 8th, we start another Writing for Your Life online conference called Writing in the Second Half of Life. So anybody interested in those kinds of events can go to writingforyourlife.com. And as part of this series, we have 3 more webinars coming up. The next one is Wednesday, October 6th, with Jennifer Grant, Brian Mclaren, and Sophronia Scott. So, 3 more really bright people, just like the 3 bright people that we've had here today. And I know personally, I could just spend, plenty of time, several hours talking with the 3 of you to, pick your brains about all the different issues that we have facing us today. So I want to thank you all for sharing that with us and spending some time with us to, share your thoughts with people that, may not necessarily always get to hear from you. So, thanks for doing that, and greatly appreciate it. For everyone else, thank you so much for joining us, and hope you can make it for the rest of the sessions. But bye for now. Thanks again.
Thank you.